Does the idea of right and wrong come from God, or does morality come from somewhere else? These questions are the central topic of the article that Geoffrey Morgan wrote called On the Divine Command Theory and Natural Law Theory. Hi, I'm Toby Parmalee and welcome to my article review. Please like and subscribe below to see more videos. In this article review, I want to talk about the topics that the author discusses and then also his position on those different theories. Then I want to see some arguments that he makes about them and kind of take a deep look into them and see how they have some contradictions to them that end up weakening the thesis that he makes. So to summarize his article, Morgan talks about two different theories called the divine command theory and the natural law theory. Now he describes the divine command theory as this: it sees moral obligation as equivalent to and dependent on the commands of God. Now what this is saying is that all morality comes from the commands that God gave us, and that we are morally obligated to obey whatever commands we receive from God because He is morality. Now the second theory, the natural law theory, Morgan describes as this: it takes morality to be implicit in God's creation of the universe and rational human beings. So what this is saying is that God created a natural law and gave us our own reasoning so that through our reasoning we can determine what is right and wrong, and that we do not even need to believe in God or know His commandments to determine the right course of action. Now, in Morgan's position on both of these theories, he says that both of them deserve some credit because they have some good qualities to them, and yet they also have some serious weaknesses that can't be avoided. This leads Morgan to his thesis in his article that morality could be supported by some religions. It's a nice idea that could encourage morality, and yet morality is not at all dependent on any religious faith. And so that is the thesis that he takes throughout his entire article. Now, if we take a deeper look into his thesis, these are the words that he uses. Religious faith might support moral life, but morality is not dependent on faith. Now, the evidence that he uses to get to that conclusion are the arguments that he makes against the divine command theory and the natural law theory. But if we look at those arguments he makes, there are some presuppositions that he makes that show an unbelief in God, which seems to affect his thinking in his arguments. So the first one, for example, is with the divine command theory. In this command theory, he states, how can we resolve issues that arise from applying ancient commands to contemporary moral problems? Now the issue with what he's saying here is when he refers to the ancient commands, he seems to be assuming that God's law is outdated, and this kind of contradicts what he says at another point about how God is omniscient. Here he seems to be assuming God is not actually omniscient. The problem is, let's say if God is omniscient, wouldn't he be able to know the current issues of today when he wrote the commands thousands of years ago? And so how would we have trouble applying commands when he may have written them just for today? Now another issue that the author makes is with the natural law theory. In this one, he says that the NLT is in contradiction to, quote, today's successful scientific reasoning. Now to see the problem with this, I first want to go back to the idea of the NLT, which is that God created a natural law and our reasoning, and through our reasoning, we can determine right and wrong independent of belief in God or God's commands. Now this raises the question of what is the purpose of God's commands? One suggestion that Morgan gives is that God's commands are a kind of fail-safe for us. After all, if God is omniscient, then he's all-knowing, and his reasoning and determining of what is right and wrong would be infallible. And his point is that this would be useful for us since our own reasoning is sometimes subject to error. Now, the issue is right there with what he said. How can we rely on our own, what he calls successful scientific reasoning, when he admits that our reasoning is subject to error? That would make reasoning unreliable and untrustworthy. Therefore, his argument that, well, NLT is in contradiction to scientific reasoning is not valid enough to disqualify the NLT. Now, the problem here is that the NLT also faces a problem if our reasoning is subject to error, because its whole idea is that we don't need to know God's commands. We can determine right and wrong because of our own reasoning. Now, if it's saying that our reasoning is subject to error, and that's why we need the commands, how can he also say we don't need the commands because of our reasoning? It's a contradiction that the NLT has to face. And yet, even with these issues, and there are other issues with the divine command theory as well that I have not discussed, and yet the problem is that Morgan's arguments also have issues that are not valid enough to disqualify these two theories. And this makes Morgan's thesis weak that morality does not need to be grounded on any religion. Another reason for this is because Morgan assumes that these two theories are the only reasons why morality would be grounded on religion. Suppose there's another theory why, and he doesn't seem to entertain that idea in his article. In conclusion to all of that, I think it would still be really good for everyone to read this article. It provides a great introduction to divine command theory and natural law theory. And if someone is religious or non-religious, it's good to know these philosophical ideas that are well known today, and it would give us a good, well-educated knowledge.